Everyone knows that to get rich is glorious, but what happens after you get rich? Do you actually have any control over how that wealth transforms you and your behaviour? Quite a serious question, isn't it? I'm Angus Stewart, and you're listening to episode 14 of the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast. Our book for this episode is Empires of Dust by Jiang Zilong, published by Elaine Charles Asia's Sinolist Books imprint. The original Chinese version was published in 2008 as Nongmin Diguo. Roughly translates as, well, if you can't work it out for yourself, you'll find out in the interview that I'm doing, or that we have this episode. It's me talking to Christopher Payne, one of the book's two translators. Before we get to that, I'll just do the usual plugs. So this podcast has an Instagram, TrChFic. I'm on Twitter, Angus Likes Words, and if you want to support the show, there's a Buy Me a Coffee page. You can find it in the show notes if you want to give a one-off contribution. If you want to give a wee monthly contribution and get access to the bonus shows that I make for every episode, then you can find our Patreon. You can Google Translated Chinese Fiction Podcast Patreon, or you can find the link in the show notes. That's it for the plugs. I did it quickly this time. So without further ado, let's hear from Christopher. Editor's note here, my audio at the very start of the interview is weird. I don't know why. I apologise for that, but it does clear up immediately after that, just initial part. Right, so we're on the show with Christopher Payne, translator, Empires of Dust, another one of its translators. So Chris, have you on?
Thank you.
And I understand that you've just moved back from England to your homeland of Canada. So how's that going?
It's going well. It's been a bit of a whirlwind. I think me personally, I'm still a bit jet lagged because I just kind of returned to Canada about almost a week ago now. So it's still kind of reorienting myself to being back home. Thankfully, the family already moved earlier, so it wasn't as though I have to do everything immediately. So that's made the transition home much easier.
It's good to stagger things like that.
Very much so.
So I believe the translators who've been on the show previously have all been freelance translators. But as I understand it, you're not just a translator, you're an academic who's had something like a 9-to-5 job. Is that right?
Yes, more or less. So my main career, I suppose, is teaching at university. It's not 9-to-5 necessarily, but it's probably longer than that. But I squeeze in time for translation in the evenings and at weekends and so on. So it's, I guess, trying to work around the schedule as much as possible.
Okay, good to know. So am I right in thinking you work in kind of the East Asian studies field? Is that right?
Yes, yeah. So my PhD was more specifically in Chinese studies, but my background is East Asia as a whole. And so my second East Asian language is Korean, and I've lived in Korea actually for quite a bit of time, and I've also done not translation work from Korean to English, but I have done quite a bit of research into Korean literature, Chinese literature, Taiwanese literature, and kind of down even into Southeast Asia, into what they call Sinophone communities.
Oh, okay.
So a bit broad, I guess, but it's good not to be pigeonholed into one kind of small area. Although I guess China and the Chinese-speaking world isn't exactly small, but try to keep it as diverse as possible.
Well, scale is an interesting thing because obviously it's a huge country, but just doing this podcast, just over 10 episodes, I found the world of C to E, Chinese to English, isn't that huge.
No, it's not. That's for sure.
I'm definitely going to ask you some more questions about your background later on, but I think it would be good to crack on and talk about the book. But before we do that, Is there anything else you'd like to listeners to know about you, kind of in advance of talking about the book itself and your work?
I guess not specifically, no. I mean, I've been working on Chinese literature now for, 20 years. So it's been with me for a long time. I started in the late 90s and kind of spent time in China in the late 90s. Was there for the Hong Kong handover.
Oh,
We're witnessing the after effects of that today in the
yes, we
news.
are.
So it's been a long time with me, I guess, is the only thing I'd like to say. Not
Okay.
always translating, but certainly with it and reading translations and then ultimately doing translations. So it's hard to imagine a life now without Chinese literature, I suppose.
Mm, definitely. So, onto the story itself, the book Empires of Dust. It's a very long book. It's got a very big cast,
It
but
does.
it's very centered around one guy. So, let's do an elevator pitch. Who is this character? What can you tell us about the protagonist?
Well, the protagonist is a man by the name of Guo Zhenxian, and he's I guess he's aspiring to be something more than what he is and where he comes from. So he comes from this very small kind of poor community in the northeast part of China. It's a difficult area, difficult land to kind of use for agriculture and so on. So very poor, humble background, but he grew up essentially with the changes of modern China. So the revolutionary kind of warlord periods in the early 20th century is where his family story begins, and he's kind of a young person at the time, but then he kind of comes of age throughout the 1950s and into the 60s, so the tumult of the Cultural Revolution, and then finally he succeeds, I guess, in a material sense with the reforms that happened from the 1980s onwards. But with that, of course, I guess, like many good novels and good stories, there's the rise and fall. We all like to see our heroes fall,
Hmm.
it seems. So I think he kind of matches that trajectory as well. And ultimately, you see how, I guess, the material wealth brings with it this degree of corruption, in some cases, really extreme corruption. And he's summarily, I guess, punished for that. But he's an interesting fellow, I find. Is starting as making coffins in the early days, and kind of to the heights that he does reach. I suppose in many ways he's like any character like that everyman who wants to do something better for his life and for his family, but
Hmm.
the more you reach, I guess, the more difficult it becomes to kind of take hold of that and actually, in a sense, I guess you forget what it was that you were fighting for, or what you were working for in the first place. And I think that's kind of what happens to him. He forgets his family to a degree. I mean, he becomes adulterous and so on and so
Yes,
forth. Whereas
very much so.
yeah, very much so. Whereas he professes in the earlier parts of the novel that he would love her forever and so on and so forth. So there's a tragic element certainly to the character, and in that sense, I guess it does speak somewhat to the period that Jiang Zilong is talking about, with the promise of reform, the promise of opening up, the promise of, I mean, I think there's a phrase that's accredited to Deng Xiaoping that is, to get rich is glorious.
Yep.
Doesn't seem to jive well with socialist values, but it's that kind of the promise of something better, and I guess you don't necessarily realize that there are costs to pay. It's not just get rich. You I guess there's the balancing act, and in a
Yeah,
sense he fails on that.
spectacularly.
Yeah, spectacularly. And I guess there's some truth in the sense that it does parallel things that you see in the news with China, with regard to the next official that is falls from power because of corruption scandals. Now, a
Hmm.
lot of times these are politically motivated, and I think there's that element in the book as well. But certainly there is, the rise and fall. I guess that's a good way to sum up him as a character. Maybe a bit of a cautionary tale, I suppose,
Yeah.
some regard. But the writer Jiang Zilong kind of comes from what they used to call, and I guess in some ways they still use the term, but a red background. He's not an intellectual. He wasn't trained. He didn't go to university. He trained rather in mechanics, and started on the farm, went to the factory, all of these types of things. So he's got this unassailable red background. And for him, I suppose, in a way, looking at the changes in society, it's probably quite stark to see these.
And he was a factory boss for a while, right?
He was, yes. So he kind of, he went from, in a way, the poor background that Guo experienced, really. And then, worked his way up and became a factory boss ultimately. And now he's, a well-respected author in China as this kind of a model writer, as they might have said once upon a time.
Yeah.
And
just to clarify, that was a factory boss under the communist system. Is that right?
Actually, yes, it was still under the communist system. It would have been under the state-owned enterprises.
Yes.
So ostensibly under the communist system, but it was in the period of marketization and opening up.
Right.
It wasn't under necessarily the traditional form of state-ruled kind of dictates and stuff like that in terms of 5-year plans. They still have 5-year plans, but they're not the same as they used to be, I suppose. But yeah, so it's a state-owned enterprise is the phrase that they would use.
Yeah. Now, when I was trying to think of a Western parallel character for Guo, I suppose there's plenty of tragic heroes who rise and fall, but probably the state goes in towards the end of the novel when he's getting sadistic. I think the words, at least in the English, your English version, the word sadistic or sadism pops up a few times. It reminded me of Daniel Plainview from the film There Will Be Blood. Right. When he's just yelling abuse at people. His adopted son and the minister who was his long-time rival. And when I went to look at Daniel Plainview's Wikipedia page, he got described as a protagonist villain. Right. So would you say he's our hero's a protagonist villain? And do you think he's got any Western twins that immediately spring to mind?
I think the phrase protagonist villain is a great way to describe Guo. I think it does kind of sum him up. Other Western characters that kind of jump out to me, I was trying to think about this, how we could parallel things. And I think it's difficult to say because for Jiang, he's very much writing within the Chinese context of things.
Absolutely, yeah.
And he doesn't necessarily... I mean, even reading his other works, for instance, he doesn't necessarily see this beyond the Chinese kind of sphere. And in a sense, I suppose there is that insular quality to Jiang's writing, that he's very much a Chinese writer writing for a Chinese market, which I guess in a way kind of makes it difficult to pitch this book overseas to an English market because it is so focused on China. It is such a specific story to them, and for Chinese readers, this rise and fall that the main character goes through, it's echoed in newspapers, it's echoed in the news broadcasts in the evening news and so on and so forth. So for them, it would probably seem very intimate, very visceral for them. But yeah, I think protagonist villain is a great phrase. I mean, I wasn't familiar with it, but I think it's a great way of describing Guo Zixian for sure.
Well, I remember when I was 18 or 17 browsing around on the website TV Tropes, there's all these endless arguments about whether a character is an anti-hero or a heroic villain. There's all these different variations on blurring between hero and villain. And I suppose, I don't know, I always felt that they were a bit arbitrary. They all mean roughly the same thing. But anyway, speaking of terms to describe Guo, there is a piece of vocabulary I learned quite early on in my time in China, one that I would use to get a laugh. It was tu hao. Do you know tu hao?
Tu hao, yes.
Yeah. Would you say Guo's a tu hao?
Yeah, I think that's another good description for him as well, for sure. There's lots of other slang, I suppose, that you could probably use for it. But I would agree. Tu hao is probably a good way of phrasing him.
Could you teach us another piece of slang for the listeners?
Well, the one that I actually kind of like was used. It's a Beijing dialect. It's referring
Nice.
to somebody as the Laoer, so old too. But it was used in the 60s for Confucius and for Lin Biao. But I always kind of
Ah,
like that phrase where they would call him Kongzi Laoer. So basically, Confucius the prick. Or, you could probably be more colorful with that if you wanted to.
yes.
And I think there's a quality to Guo Zhenxian that he becomes a prick later on in the story. I think his positive qualities as this family man, hard worker and stuff is somewhat dampened as the novel progresses, and he becomes a sadistic person. He becomes
Yeah.
a nasty person. So you would think of my boss is a prick type of thing. I think that would probably be quite apropos.
Yes, definitely. So you talked a bit about how this is a particularly Chinese book, or even a particularly mainland Chinese book in its own context. And when I was reading this book, I did some reading around looking for English language articles on it.
Mm-hmm.
I found a good one on the South China Morning Post, and I found a good review of the book, or an informative review of the book by a former guest of the show and your fellow Canadian countryman, Dylan Levi King. And they
Mm-hmm.
both introduced me to the term reform novel, which, in my ignorance, I'd never come across before. And it seemed like Jiang is maybe the best or most textbook example of an author who writes reform novels. But you probably could explain better than me what a reform novel is and how well Empires of Dust fits that category. So could you do that for the listeners?
Sure. I mean, I guess a bit of extra context to where this term reform novel comes from.
Mm-hmm.
If you think of the Cultural Revolution ending in 1976 and the reemergence of different literary styles that come in the aftermath of it, I mean, the probably the more well known would be scar literature,
Yes.
which you had early translations into English and so on and so forth about the trauma of the Cultural Revolution and so on. And then there was this throughout the 1980s, there was this subsequent development of multiple literary styles. So in poetry, you have what's called misty poetry,
Mm-hmm.
and Beidao would be an example there. And then you get the search for roots literature. And I think the search for roots literature, well-known people like Moyan and these people that kind of emerge out of this group. You have an experimental literature, and to be fair, reform literature is kind of a retroactive title that's put to certain works of literature that come out during from the mid 1980s onwards. So
Okay.
it wasn't always a common, I guess, a genre type.
Mm.
The literature existed, but the title itself kind of happens afterwards. So when I was first studying, it was always search for roots literature or experimental literature that happens with Yuhua and these people who are very well known internationally.
Right.
And then you have these other writers like Jiang who are working on their literature at the same time, but they don't necessarily fit into these categories of, say, search for roots, which is looking at more Chinese traditions in the past and trying to reconnect or recreate some kind of sense of long history of China. So reform literature, I guess the best qualities of it or the characteristics of it are the ones that deal more with the present day things that China was going through in the 1980s and into the 1990s. So in a
Mm-hmm.
sense, I suppose they're a continuation of socialist realism, which would have
Yeah.
been the dominant form throughout the 1950s and so on, except they steer away from what socialist realism became during the Cultural Revolution, which was more revolutionary romanticism,
Yeah.
where it was, the glories of the revolution, the utopia they're building.
It stops
Um,
being realistic.
it stops being realistic, yeah, precisely. So I think that's where writers like Jiang, that's where they found their niche. They're continuing this tradition of realistic writing that's very grounded in the realities of the period. And of course, from the 1980s onwards, it's the reform period.
Mm-hmm.
Although the way they were talking about it wasn't necessarily in those terms, insofar as that with 1989, of course, and what happens in Beijing and Tiananmen at that time, there's this what they call a Beijing winter kind of returns, and so into the first couple of years of the 1990s, you don't really. I guess the academic circles, when you're looking at literature of that period, it's very tentative in how we're going to describe this and how we're going to talk about this because of the associated politics of cultural production. So then in the 1990s, when things kind of open up again, that's where you really get the opening up period, I suppose, after what they say, they kind of started with Deng Xiaoping's 1993 tour of the South.
Oh, yes.
And that's the return, I guess, of China and the opening up of it into the world community and really when marketization kind of takes place. And with marketization, of course, you get corruption. And you know, the temptations of money and so on. So that's where you get this, then you get a retroactive term kind of put on reform literature and say, yeah, wait a minute, this is literature that's writing about, you know, the decentralization of the economy, the selling off of state-owned enterprises, the shift from socialist economics to socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is, you know, in many ways a more laissez-faire type of capitalism than you have in, say, the UK or in North America.
Indeed, yeah.
So that's where the term comes from. It's, I guess, so in a sense, I look at it as an academic, as a kind of continuation of socialist realism, but it's realism about the reforms, about the positive things and, of course, the negative things that have come with reform.
Yeah.
Does that help answer it, I guess, in a sense?
Yeah, that's a really good answer. I don't remember Deng's name popping up too much in the novel, but no. I definitely felt like it was kind of a Deng novel.
Yes, it certainly is. I mean, he's in the background, and then that's the thing. It's this idea of what I mentioned before, the phrase that Deng may have said, that "get rich is glorious." There's also, I think, if I remember, the question about doesn't matter what color the cat is, so long as it catches the mice and these types of things. So he's there, certainly in the background of the novel.
So as I was reading, I did feel that it was definitely kind of telling the story of reform, and in a way that was more or less in step with, I guess, the CCP's official story of the highs and the lows of and why things had to change. But in the novel there is some pretty striking depiction and criticism of what you could say is the insanity of the Cultural Revolution. Just so people who haven't read the book know what I'm talking about, there's a couple wee excerpts I printed out that I'm going to read. Let me just shuffle my papers and find them.
Sure.
I'm going to shuffle them obnoxiously so everyone hears. Right. So here's the first one. It's from what I remember, this is a character giving a speech on the village stage or village centre during the kind of peak of the Cultural Revolution. So he says, "Rebellious comrades, we see the problem here. It's totally clear. Taiwan has its bald leader, old nasty Chiang Kai-shek, who still longs to reclaim the mainland. The Soviet Union, too, has its bald master, the vile revisionist Khrushchev. We never thought that Guo Jian would have its own, a man who plays at being crazy. No doubt they're all in league together, one big family of bald counter-revolutionaries." So, a character is being denounced for being bald. And there's another one. I think this one's an after-the-fact one.
I mean, we can't trust the bald man, right?
That's why I don't trust my dad. Okay. Oh no, not this one. Yes. So I think this is Guo after the fact of the Cultural Revolution, kind of having a pop at it. So he says, "We've all seen how it works. To put it bluntly, to be poor is glorious. To be left-wing is even more glorious. And causing a riot is great. If you're a good actor, you can get away with it. And anyone who just goes with the flow ends up in power." So pretty cynical, bitter take on the whole thing. So what question was I going to ask about all this? Yeah, were you surprised by any of these contents of the book as you were reading through it? Or do you think it's not too shocking, given that it's kind of kosher in China to talk this way about the Cultural Revolution?
I wasn't wholly shocked by it, I have to say, because as you just said, I think it is kind of kosher to talk about the Cultural Revolution and the insanities of it. And I think that's kind of expected to some extent. It would be strange, for instance, if he were to kind of applaud the Cultural Revolution, or talk about only the positive things, if there were any
Right.
that came out of it, and so on. So I think there is an element that there's an expectation now that you can criticize it. But what I enjoyed with reading Jiang's was the humor that came with it.
Yeah.
There's that dark humor in his description of it. So it wasn't just coming out and saying this was madness or these policies were crazy. Because if you read the I guess the words for their surface value, it looks as though he's talking about how these things were good. And you could say going with the flow is good advice in any time period. But at the same time, is that the moral quandary, I suppose, that comes up with this, denouncing someone because they're bald, or going along with the flow when you know how wrong things are, and so on and so forth. So that's where I enjoyed those sections, and the dark humor that's there with them. But yeah, I guess I wouldn't say totally shocked by it or surprised by it. I've seen actually much worse, or I guess worse is not the right way to describe it, but um, much more penetrating criticism of the Cultural Revolution in literature, and even more specifically, naming the party as the culprit, whereas Jiang kind of doesn't do that.
Indeed. Yes.
It's never the party that's done this. It's people at the time that take advantage of the policies and the craziness, and they go too far. And I think there's the expectation in the novel that ultimately the party will root out these elements. So a good element becomes a bad element that gets rooted out, and there's this self-corrective kind of procedure that the party goes through periodically. And I think that, I mean, if you look at it parallel today, that's Xi Jinping's anti-corruption drive is seen as another iteration of that the party is correcting itself. Things kind of get out of hand, there people take advantage of it, but the institution itself is not the problem. It's these vile kind of people within it that take advantage of the situation.
Yep, and that can just go on until the end of time. Sounds great.
Yeah, pretty much.
Right. So after all this dark talk, I've got some lighter questions. Do you have a favorite moment in the novel?
Actually, my favorite moment is a dark moment. It's
yes, good.
Very early on when it's during the food supplement period, when they're trying to feed the people that are enduring famine, and the party kind of offers this contest to the villages in the area, and the village that can make the most food out of no materials would be the winner. And I just absolutely love that section, the absurdity of it all. I mean, I'm a great fan of absurdity and absurdist theater and these types of things. And the way that particular chapter, I think it's chapter 3, maybe 4, the way it's pitched as this is kind of real. These are, there's the quotation at the beginning of the chapter that kind of reads as an official document that these are real things that they were doing, and I guess the seriousness that the contest was pitched at, that you will win if you can make the most food with nothing. And I loved it. I laughed out loud when I was translating it, kind of thing. So it was a favorite moment in the novel, definitely. I guess it's really dark when you think about it.
Incredibly, yeah.
But I don't know, I've always kind of enjoyed those types of things. I remember watching Pulp Fiction in the cinema, and when they're arguing about the quarter pounder with cheese, and then they blow the guy sitting in the back seat, blow his head off, I laughed. I thought this is an absurd scene. It's violent, it's gruesome, but it was, how can you not laugh at the absurdity of it all? So,
well, to add a somber note, I was kind of prepped for those sections of the book because I'd been doing research for my dissertation, and the start of that involved just surveying what translated Chinese things were available. So I made a trip to my local library, which at that time was the Edinburgh Central Library, and I found a great big hardback copy of Tombstone. I think it's that Yang Jisheng that wrote
Right.
that. Do you know that
Yeah,
one?
yeah, yeah.
And I
Yes, I
only
do.
read,
Yeah.
yeah, I didn't. I only had it for a library borrow, and I had lots of stuff to read. But I was captivated enough to get through, I don't know, a few hours worth of it. And oh man, given that it was just the very opening segments of the book and the kind of numbers of and the policies that are described, it's
It's
dark. But
shocking.
I suppose through
Yeah,
the lens of
it's
fiction, it's in some ways easier to process.
I would think so. Yeah. I mean, I guess that's what I mean, if you think of a European tradition, I mean, it's tragedy. That's what we need. We need to see these tragic works. We need to see the gruesomeness of life. That's where we get that catharsis, I suppose, of being able to deal with the darkness of it. Because I mean, I guess if you speak of or think of trauma, and one of the ways of looking at it psychologically is that it's trauma is something that you can't narrativize, you can't put into words, hence it's traumatic.
Mm,
And then the way to deal with it, of course, is to try and verbalize it, try and put it, give it a story, trying to make it something that can be thought about. Um, and certainly that's, I guess, what Yang Jisheng is doing with Tombstone. Is putting this into words, not only for an audience to read about the horrors of this because it's important to know, but also I think for himself to put these into words, to process this traumatic period in his personal life.
hmm
And I think there's an element of that in Empires of Dust too, whether it's the dark bits of the Cultural Revolution, the famine that precedes it, and then also the reform. Because I think Jiang, like many other people at that time, probably put a lot of faith in the reform and opening up,
hmm
and really believed what this was doing in terms of so-called bringing China back to the international stage and its rightful place. I don't necessarily subscribe to these ideas. I don't know what country has a rightful place on the world stage, whatever that may be.
Big
But I
ones.
think big ones, I guess. But I think there's an element there that certainly Jiang believed in that. And then once you witness what happens with this, the corruption, um, that I think becomes very difficult to deal with. That these
hmm
promises that they were kind of given, that this is going to reform China and open up the system, that to see it kind of twisted in the way that it has been in terms of these corruption cases, which you seem to hear a new one every day.
hmm
I think there is an element of trauma that continues for them um, in a
Yeah.
certain way, not to the same degree, I suppose, as the Cultural Revolution. You don't have the same degree of violence, but I think it is still a traumatic experience for them to see
Mm.
what's happened, and there is a concern for the future in that sense of where it's going.
We seem to have gotten quite dark again.
Yes, but I mean, I guess, but a way of dealing with tragedy and trauma is through humor, I think,
Yes.
and that certainly comes out in that my favorite section of the book, and I think in other places throughout the novel as well. Um, you kind of have to laugh at the humor of it, the absurdity of it, and I think
hmm
that's that cathartic experience that you can get from it. Um, where you mentioned earlier before we technically began, you sit and watch the newspapers about Brexit in a bemused
Ah,
fashion. So maybe
well,
that's
yeah. I mean,
the same type of approach.
I was, whilst we had Theresa May as our leader, I was regularly disappointed, but comfortable in the fact that at least we didn't have a clown as our leader,
Mhm.
like our neighbours across the pond do. And now we do. We have another bleach blonde clown. So send
Yeah,
in the clowns.
send in the clowns indeed.
Yeah. I'm quite envious of countries with more bland leaders like China.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Um, so, keeping on the theme of bits of the novel that pop out at us, I did think, apart from our central character, Guo Sun Xian, Guo Sun, it is
Yeah,
Xian, isn't it?
yeah,
Guo Sun
yeah.
Xian. Making myself look really informed here. Apart from him, I think quite a lot of the characters were a bit 2D. or flat. But I did think there were moments where they do kind of pop. They have good
Yes.
character moments. Were there any kind of secondary characters who you latched onto, or who you think had some kind of scene stealing moments?
I mean, the grandfather.
Oh yes, definitely.
I mean, besides Guo, I mean, he was probably actually the grandfather was probably my favorite character, more so than Guo, because I just like that kind of character. I enjoyed translating it. I enjoyed, the scenes where he's in the novel and then the kind of craziness that he gets up to and, climbing up into the tree that's filled with snakes and so on and so forth. I love those moments. It was, you're kind of reading it and translating it and they do kind of stick out to me.
Hmm.
Um,
He
so
kind
yeah,
of
I
felt
guess
like he'd sneaked in from a different book to me.
yes, yeah, for sure. And I think in the early part of the novel, when you first see what's happening and you hear the stories of the phoenix trees and so on and so forth, that you really kind of, I was wondering where the novel was going to take me because it had
Absolutely.
this kind of mysticism to it or magical element type of
Magical
thing. And then
realism.
yeah, well, exactly. In the Latin American tradition.
Mm.
And it changes from that afterwards, very much
Yeah,
so,
bit,
and
bit of a
becomes much more
tease.
that, yeah, a bit of a tease for sure, which is interesting, if insofar as that the magical realism of Latin American literature was incredibly popular in the 1980s in
Uh-huh.
China. And you had people engaging with Borges, particularly,
Mm.
and Borges' work. And so you get authors like Gefei and Yuhua and Ma Yuan, and there's several more that you could talk about that really just were transfixed by magical realism. So in a sense, I guess Jiang was growing up in that period, was writing in that period, and so on and so forth. So in the same way, I'm sure he was exposed to that type of literature as well.
Yeah.
So it kind of seeps into the novel, I suppose, in a way that's unexpected, especially if you compare Empires of Dust to his earlier works. They're much more well, they're shorter. For instance, for one characteristic of them, and they're much more realistic.
Mm.
Than these elements that you see in moments in Empires of Dust, where it's a little bit, yeah, it stretches the boundaries of what's realistic and what isn't, I
Yep.
suppose. Um, there's
I
probably a
remember
study or an article at least to write about that, maybe.
for sure. I remember when I was in my, I think, first and second year in China, visiting some bookshops. Chinese, I think there were like the first place I lived in, there was no English language bookshop, but there was a fairly large Xinhua or something bookshop.
Yeah.
And I remember they would have little stacks of their Western classics, and there was always a Gabriel Garcia Marquez in there.
Yes.
And then I noticed it more after moving to Shanghai. So yeah, I could see maybe the legacy of that
Hmm.
surge in popularity, if not necessarily when it was happening. And I just this year, I read The Garden of Forking Paths by Borges. Have you read that one?
Okay. No, I haven't actually.
Well, it's the narrator is Chinese, and I think he has some kind of German connection as well. I don't know if he's a Chinese Qingdao guy,
Right. Okay.
but not to spoil it too much, but there is like a lot of Borges stories. There's a text that it's a
Hmm.
kind of a story about a book, a magical book of some sort, and it's a
Right.
book. That book is a Chinese book, weirdly enough.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. I mean, Borges' Chinese Labyrinth is kind of one of the well-known examples,
Mm.
and they talk on it. And I mean, in that sense, Borges is carrying on a tradition that Ezra Pound, in the late 1800s, kind of in early 20th century, enjoyed, where he envisioned Chinese characters as a way of writing modern literature, modern poetry, because they were all little symbols of something else that you could then expound upon the symbolic possibilities of one singular Chinese character. And
Right.
certainly there you get that in magical realism as well. So a kind of continuation of a modernist impulse that I guess fantasizes about a Chinese character, and it's the possibilities of meaning that you can see with it. And so yeah, it's interesting how certain kind of traditions cross-pollinate each other.
Hmm.
Where you get a Chinese tradition kind of inspiring Pound, and then later on other writers throughout Europe and then into Latin America, and then you get magical realism with Gabriel Garcia Marquez and so on, kind of pollinating the a revival of Chinese literature in the 1980s. I find it really fascinating, these kind of transcultural translation kind of pollinating traditions.
Yeah,
It's a fascinating kind of area that's
and that
oftentimes
one's
overlooked.
yeah, that one's especially interesting because it sidesteps the Anglosphere, the Anglo-American world
Yes.
of literature. But yeah,
Yeah, no, very much so. I mean, there's probably there's an element of politics in that as well,
definitely. Yeah.
insofar as that China saw itself as the leader of the non-aligned movement, what we used to call the third world, and so on and so forth. And Latin
Yes.
America was part and parcel of that. So there was a lot of kind of discussions that yeah sidestepped the Anglosphere. Um, and kind of continued on into the 80s and into the 90s. I mean, I think even some of the revolutionary groups in Latin America still refer to themselves as Maoists.
Oh yeah.
So
Hmm.
it's strange how these things work.
Yes, politics is definitely crazy. Um,
Uh,
so speaking of cultural transmission, I'd like to go to phase two. I'm going to ask you some things about translation, the translation
sure.
of this book. So I mentioned at the start of the show that you're actually just one of the book's two C to E, Chinese to English translators. So who was your colleague, and how did you two go about working together on this project?
Sure. Well, my colleague is Olivia Milburn. She's a professor at Seoul National University in Korea, UK national, actually.
Okay.
I met Olivia when I was doing my PhD at SOAS at University of London. And she had graduated, I think, a couple of years before me and was doing some teaching while working on other projects and stuff. And that's how we first met. And then she ended up. I went to Korea. I was working in university there in Korea while I was finishing up my PhD, and then she got this position at Seoul National. And so we kind of reconnected then when we were both in the same country. And we've actually collaborated on two other books
Oh
before
yeah.
Empires of Dust.
Now I
So
know one of
some
them.
years ago.
It's Decoded. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, Decoded. So we worked on Mai Jia, who is
Yes.
another contemporary author in China, and we did his Decoded, Jie Mi, and then we also did his second novel called in the English translation is In the Dark or Answan. And so we did those, and it was a great kind of collaboration. We really enjoyed working together. It was a good way to kind of deal with translating or the demands of translating, and at the same time the demands of writing academic work.
Mm.
So as an academic, we were also required to publish research essays and so on and so forth. That's I guess our 9 to 5 job type of thing. So it was a good way to work on it. We've got a kind of the same sensibility when we come to looking at literature and so on and so forth.
Mm.
Her specialism is actually ancient China, but we're both big
Okay.
avid readers of contemporary Chinese literature. And I remember her telling me that she wanted to read more, and she started choosing the Mao Dun winners. So Mao Dun, very famous Chinese writer from the early
Yes.
20th century, literature prize, and so on and so forth. So we started, yeah, we were just reading and comparing notes, and then we kind of submitted a sample for Maijia, and it was accepted, and that kind of started the collaboration. Um,
Sweet.
and and then afterwards, with Empires of Dust, I was the one that was first approached by it because I happened to be in the UK, where Alain Charles Asia is based,
Yes.
and they contacted me about my interest in translating, and I first looked at the novel and saw it's 700, 800 pages,
You were
and
like, ah!
yeah, well, exactly. I was like, I don't think I have the time to do all of this myself because there was a deadline to kind of having it finished. So then I reached out to Olivia again and I said, how about we work on another novel together? And she was excited about it. And yeah, we kind of we talked with ACA and they were happy for us to do it together. And yeah, so we went on and did it. I mean, I guess our process of working on it, we talk a lot about the story. We'll email back and forth type of thing about the novel, trying to work on, you know, names and titles and these types of things, and working on the tone. So we would exchange pieces as we progressed through the novel. We kind of divided it up. Ironically, it's Empires of Dust is 30 chapters, and it broke up into 15 each.
Okay.
I don't know how Jiang managed to do that, but in terms of kind of dividing it up, it was good that we could kind of separate it half and half.
Yep.
And yeah, so as we progressed through it, of course, we're both reading each other's sections and trying to match up tone and so on and so forth. And then once we get the final kind of the whole manuscript finished, we would then reread each other's work again to make sure there's a consistent kind of narrative flow through it. And then we had editors, of course, at ACA, which is great. They have in-house editors, which
it's a valuable resource.
It's an incredibly valuable resource, because our experience with Penguin, with Maija, is that they farmed out the editors.
Even Penguin,
yeah.
Oh
So
my
they had
God.
freelancers, and I think we ended up working with 2 or 3 over the course of it. So there was more work for us to do, in the sense of making sure that everything kind of matched style-wise and so on and so forth. So it was great that ACA has them in-house, and we work with Martin and David, and yeah, I think the final product came out well. There's still things that we could maybe, I guess, polish up a little bit. There was, I think, Dylan mentioned it in his review about the measurements and stuff like that. I think we put in how much is a mu and how much is a li and these types of things.
Some of the use of brackets jarred me a bit.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we should have thought more about, and probably should have gotten rid of before. In translating, there's always this element of trying to make the text as accessible to an English reader as possible. But at the same time, you also have this requirement to be filial to the original. And then
you don't want to clog up the bottom of the page with footnotes as well.
Yeah, exactly. And that was something we tried to avoid as much as possible, was footnotes. We probably could have had a lot more. We did have a few, but I think we did well to kind of reduce the number of footnotes. And then the thing with measurements and other specific things, that certain words, I didn't really like translating the measurements into the metric system or the imperial system. I wanted to keep the Chinese character, the words themselves in there, because it adds an element to it. You're not talking necessarily about the same world as you would if you're reading an English novel and stuff. And it's that balancing of, I think it's important for a reader to see that this is a translated work and it's a different way of looking at the world. But at the same time, you want it as accessible as possible and that it flows well for them. So it's that balancing out those two demands, I suppose.
And especially for something that's difficult. For such a specific book, such a big book, it's only going to be more tricky.
Yes, it was. But it's great. I mean, Olivia and I, we have a good kind of working relationship in that regard, that we're able to kind of communicate frequently with each other and kind of put stuff together and then feedback on each other's work and so on and so forth. So she's gone on and done other projects, so have I. We haven't had another tome to work on, but I'm certain that should something else, that warrants probably 2 translators in terms of size, we'll definitely be working together again in the future for sure.
Excellent. Thank you for that detailed answer. So I've got a wee question about swearing in this book. I'm going to read an excerpt on it. Let me just find it. Shuffle my papers. Here we go. Okay, so I think this is the narrator. I think this is the author himself writing, but seems to be kind of from Guo's perspective. Take a football stadium. That is an excellent place to scream insults at other people. Who would feel uncomfortable shouting abuse in a place like that? Alternatively, you can write anonymous letters or hurl abuse at other people right to their faces. You can also curse X when you mean Y. Curse because you might as well. Curse and then discover that nobody is paying the blindest bit of attention, and even though you know there is no point, you still carry on. You can use the insults hurried at the football to complain about how useless your boss is, about problems at the factory, about the fact that you haven't had a raise or a promotion, about the fact that society is rotten to the core, that life is pointless, and your fate is horrible. Bang. So there's quite a lot of anger in the book. There wasn't any swearing there, but when I was starting to sniff around for other podcasts about C to E books, I found one Nicky Harmon did about the chili bean paste clan and
Mhm.
about the challenges of translating local and national Chinese swear words. Did you have any challenges with that?
Uh, it's, to some extent, I would maybe say yes. Thinking of Empires of Dust, but there isn't a lot of kind of um, very specific swears that would be very much part of northeast China, where he comes from, and where the novel is set. I think that's probably partly due to the fact that he is writing under this rubric of reform literature, and there's an expectation that you don't necessarily use the coarsest language possible.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole kind of this discussion we could have about that when you think of other authors that have become internationally well known, like Yang and Yuha before them, where language and violence kind of, in some senses, it's the selling point or marketing point for these works. I don't think Empires of Dust necessarily has that.
Oh, okay.
Um, it's interesting because I guess it's the way we think about it. I mean, as an undergraduate student looking or reading first these novels in translation, I enjoyed reading it, and the language it felt kind of very visceral in that sense. And then I remember looking back and reading, I think it was Sutong's Rice, and I
Mm-hmm.
read the translation of it, I believe it was, and then I read the original of it, and then I kind of compared, and the phrase "tamada,"
Ah,
his mother, basically, is how it's, that's the literal translation of it, his mother's
yes.
something. But as we know, that's not generally how it's translated. It's normally, motherfucker or something a bit more colorful.
Yes.
So it's interesting how I guess we approach those types of things. So with Jiang, there was those kind of, I don't know, standard swears, I suppose.
Okay.
So we did have F bombs and stuff throughout the novel in certain sections where it seemed appropriate. We did have moments when we could speak with Jiang. Now
Oh,
he's quite
awesome.
elderly. So he was originally, actually, the plan was to have him visit the UK while we were finishing up the novel, and we were going to do a little bit of publicity with him and stuff. But he's quite an elderly fellow,
Yeah.
and ultimately he couldn't make that trip, and it was a real shame because I think it would have been fun to have him there when we kind of released the book itself, or at
Absolutely.
least some advanced publicity to talk about those types of things. So yeah, I'm it's I didn't find that there were any real specific challenges in dealing with it. Maybe I'm familiar with bad language. I'm not sure in a Chinese context.
Okay.
I could. I remember the learning early on in learning Chinese, the swearing, basically cursing somebody to back 18 generations as kind of the ultimate swear that you could use, type
Yeah.
of thing. So maybe I got that experience, I don't know, early on, and I'm quite familiar with it. But so yeah, there weren't really specific challenges, and it's interesting for me. I just finished Jia Pinghua's novel Lao Sheng. Um,
Yep.
and that was had, I mean, Jia Pinghua is very famous for his colloquialisms, the
Yes.
Shanxi dialect, and so on and so forth. And to be honest, I didn't find it intimidating. There were moments where you're kind of wondering, what exactly is he trying to say here? But the resources that we have online and so on and so forth, and so much of this is now cataloged because there is such an interest in China of the different variations of how words are used and so on and so forth.
Mm.
That
Yeah.
to me, I maybe it's because a researcher as well, and I enjoy. I mean, sometimes I could spend a day not actually translating very much because I'm researching on terms and different words and so on and so forth. So I guess that's a challenge in a sense, but it was, for me, it was always really interesting. And you kind of see all these different links and find out all these other different words and then try and think about how I can use them in the next time I'm speaking with somebody and stuff. So, yeah, I suppose the challenge is there in some regard, but in the looking at it from a different perspective, I think that sometimes is overstated. I think that there are ways of finding out that information, and having this ability to communicate with the authors, of course, is vital. That you can actually speak with the author and say, look, this is a word, this is maybe how I've read up about it online, or through whatever resources I have at my disposal. Is this really what you're trying to get at? And it's great that we've, certainly with the help of ACA, been able to kind of facilitate those lines of communication. And certainly modern technology helps with that, because we've got our WeChat or whatever type of thing that we can ask these more immediate questions.
WeChat is a gift from the gods. It's
Yeah,
so cool.
very much so. So it's challenging, yes, but I always enjoyed it. I kind of embraced that type of thing, and I didn't find it as much with Empires of Dust as I did working on Jia Pinghua's novel, and that's, I think, not surprising, insofar as different locations of where they're from and so on and so forth, and the different ways that they approach writing.
Yeah. Now, speaking of ACA, a wee birdie at ACA told me you've got a good story about how you came up with the English title for this book. Could you tell us a little bit about the translation of its Chinese title into an English title?
So Empires of Dust, well, I can't take all the credit there. It's certainly a discussion amongst several people. Daniel was involved with it as well and stuff.
That's Daniel of Elaine Charles Asia.
Yes, yeah. So, yeah, I guess the Nongmin Diguo, if you want a literal translation, it's peasant empire, or farmer empire. But I guess in discussions, it was trying to think of a phrase or a different way of putting it, as opposed to simply using peasant in the title. And then Empires of Dust was kind of hit upon, and the words used for it. For me, it was immediate that it kind of, I guess, for me growing up, thinking of what I read growing up and so on, there was an echo of Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck.
Okay, the Dust Bowl.
Yeah, the Dust Bowl. And maybe growing up in North America, we learned so much about that in school, the prairies and how they became this kind of big, huge Dust Bowl, and the problems associated with it, and the great kind of difficulties in dealing with this, and people being displaced and so on and so forth.
Right.
And to me, there's an echo of that in Empires of Dust, or in Nongmin Diguo, this idea of I mean, even the description of Guojiadian in this sunken depression with very poor sand that's more salt than soil and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I find myself wondering, why are they living here? What are they doing?
Precisely. Why till this land? And I think that's where I think Empires of Dust kind of resonates with me personally. I think that kind of sums up the story. It certainly, for the beginning part, the difficulties of tilling the land, that's why Guo leaves, because there isn't anything that's there in the town that he can make a go of. He builds coffins because people are dying left, right, and center, and that's a growth industry, I suppose. But then, even if you want to extend the analogy to look at the reforms and what happens with the reforms, and there is this element that everything that they create eventually goes up in dust, and blows away, that there is a very real kind of the environmental impact of the reforms in China, and the destruction or the desertification of the north, and the expanding Gobi Desert and all of these types of things, that I thought the sound Empires of Dust kind of fit the tone of the novel, I suppose, in a very kind of specific way, and took it away from this idea of being another farmer novel, another peasant novel, which kind of, I guess, in a sense, is somewhat of a stereotype of Chinese writing. People think of, Pearl Buck and the Good Earth type of thing.
Yes.
This hearty kind of Chinese farmers that just make do. Or if you want to jump up to, say, the mid 80s with Chen Kaige's Yellow Earth movie, right? The cinema Huang Tu Di. This idea of the good, again, it's the good earth, it's the yellow earth that's there, it's these peasants and stuff. But instead of changing it to earth, which has connotations of,
wholesomeness.
And awesomeness and bounty and so on, I think Jiang's novel is about the dust. That's eventually that's where we stand in many ways, and in another regard, it's eventually that's where we end up. It's dust,
Yep. I remember there's a line in the English translation, the earth is a vomiting carcass. I remember thinking, oh, great, that's cheerful.
Well, it's true. I mean, eventually, I mean, if to extend it, it's a vomiting carcass that then swallows us back down.
Oh boy.
Because essentially that's ultimately where we all end up. Interned and dust. So it seemed to work, I thought.
I think
it has that epic feel.
Marks the start of our podcast's Halloween period for October. Definitely.
There you go.
Yeah. We have a kind of a parallel, at least one novel in Scotland called Sunset Song, which is all about a young woman's basically living on a farm and her relationship with the land.
Right.
And yeah, it's mostly farming is not fun, the novel. Not a pleasant existence. And the stuff, your parallel with the Dust Bowl, Scotland has its own parallel, the Highland clearances, where capitalism arrived and it became more profitable to have sheep on your land than peasants.
Yes.
So that's the one we learn in school 2 or 3 times throughout the course of the education system. And the thing about the desertification, that reminded me of a thing I learned in school about North Africa. Apparently, before the Romans came along, it was quite a green land. But all the nutrients got sucked out of the soil a long time before we were born by intensive Roman farming. But the depressing side of agriculture. It
is, yeah. Well, in Canada, we also learned, we read Margaret Lawrence. So there's another Margaret writer in Canada, not like the famous Margaret Atwood, but Margaret Lawrence. And she writes about the prairies. Stone Angel was a novel we read when we were in school, and that's all about the prairies and growing up on the prairies and the difficulties of farming and stuff. And I think it's interesting when we look at kind of in certain media today where they kind of picture this bucolic past where it was, we lived in a much more balanced relationship with the environment and so on and so forth. And if only we could go back to that and so on. And it's like,
I like toilet paper too much to do that.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it's a myth. I mean, like you said, the Romans going into North Africa, right? There's the desertification of North Africa would be an example of that. It is a myth that somehow in the past we had this more bucolic type of environment to enjoy. It's part and parcel of the human condition, I think. To make use of these resources and tend to overuse them.
Yeah.
And I think that echoes in Empires of Dust as well.
Yeah. I know, like, if you ever look at a map of how big Scotland's ancient pine forests used to be and how much of that ancient forest is left now, it's really depressing. And I remember before I visited Korea, I read that a lot of Korea used to be a forest and those forests are all gone.
Yeah.
Just totally gone.
Just totally gone. Yeah, no, very much so. I mean, Korea, because I lived about 7 years in Korea, and my partner is Korean, so we're learning a lot about Korea as well. And yeah, it's shocking when you think about that, and you think about the wildlife that's disappeared and so on and so forth. I think, and there are echoes of that in Empires of Dust for sure, in terms of the relationship that people had with that land.
Yes. So moving swiftly on, because I do have. I've got to squeeze in a call with ACA,
Yeah.
and then another call at 3 about getting a damn job. So I'll ask you some questions about yourself.
Okay.
So here's an open-ended question. Be as concise or as long-winded as you wish. Oh no, the question was, what's your connection to China? We've already kind of done that, haven't we?
Sure. Yeah, I think
Yeah,
so.
let's skip that one. Um, any pieces of Chinese literature that made an early impact on you? Maybe you've mentioned a few. Could you name, like, is there one standout piece of Chinese literature that really hit you when you were starting out?
That's a good question. There's been so much. Probably the author Ge Fei, who is also a professor at Tsinghua University in Chinese literature. I remember reading his Flock of Brown Birds, He Se Niao Chun,
Okay.
and that had a really profound impact on me. It was at the same time that I was also reading Samuel Beckett's three novels. So it's Malone, Malloy Dies, and The Unnameable. I think that's the three titles.
I had no idea. Goes to show
Yeah,
my ignorance.
well, I was reading those, and there's the scene in the Beckett story where the character has these stones that he sucks on, and then he rotates them through his pocket so that he's never sucking on the same stone um, in succession. So it's always
Okay.
this elaborate kind of process. And while I was reading this short story actually by Ge Fei, there was this riding this bicycle scene in it, and it's this kind of question of what we're doing and the mechanical nature of what we're doing, but really
Mm.
with no kind of purpose of actually doing it, or there is a purpose, but it's not as if it's a necessary purpose. And it's questioning reality and all of these types of things and how we perceive the world around us. And it stuck with me, that particular story.
Right.
And it
So
was that moment when I was just like, this is, Chinese literature. I never thought of this before. I was, used to the classics, the Monkey King, the Water Barge, and these
yeah.
types of stories. And I didn't really realize that this was also kind of being produced in China. You have, of course, Liu Xun in the early 20th century that you read about and, cry out for save the children. But
Yes.
Blue Face was something different. And then I started reading more of his work. And actually, I wrote my master's thesis on Ge Fei and
Oh,
his
cool.
particular literature. So I guess that was really my starting point for really delving into Chinese literature and the impact it's had on me. I mean, I did a master's on it and then eventually did a PhD on it. So I guess I should, hold his work up as something that had a great impact on me. And it's a shame
Yeah.
he's not been translated very much,
Oh,
strangely
right.
enough. There's
Is
a few things out, but not a lot.
right. It could be a good niche kind of author episode for the show.
Yeah, well, I think Kanan Morse, I think that's the translator, did The Invisibility Cloak, which is a more recent work by Ge Fei. I think that translation came out maybe last year, the year before.
Okay.
Fairly recent, anyways. But it's one of Ge Fei's more recent works of literature. But I mean, he's been around for since the mid '80s,
Right.
and his earlier works are not really translated. There's a few short stories here and there, and his first three novels are not translated, for instance.
Okay. So publishers and translators, if you're
There you go.
listening, here's a gold
If
mine
you're
for
listening.
you.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'll take a 2% concession on all takings. And obviously you'll get a cut too.
Sounds good.
So here's a question. I don't know if any answers will spring to mind. Have you met any real life Guozunxians, either in China or outside of China?
Um, that's a hard question.
Don't get
Really.
yourself in trouble.
I would say I've met people that after doing the translation, I mean, after reading the book and then doing the translation, and then reflecting back on people I have met, I would say, yes, I've probably met people that would fit that characterization. But I don't know any of them really kind of personally. I don't, none of the people that I work with would really kind of delve down that road that Guo eventually goes on. But I think there's a realistic quality to him, that there are certainly people in China that are like that.
Yeah,
But I think there's people everywhere that are like that. You
absolutely.
know,
Yeah.
whether it's in the UK or Europe or North America, there are people that will take advantage of the situations, and there seems to be no bounds to how far they can go.
We definitely have a highly seated womanizer here in the UK right now, down in London.
Yeah,
Not a,
yeah.
not a handsome one either.
Yeah, it seems that oftentimes they're not, right?
No, funny that. Yeah, some of the kind of dining slash banquet scenes near the end of the novel reminded me of some experiences I had in my first year in small town China, either for like work meals out, or sometimes you'd be on a lesser meal, but the restaurant owner would see a foreigner, and
Yeah,
he would go kind of go into like tu hao mode and make you
yeah.
drink and give you food. You know, terrible, awful thing I had to suffer being given baijiu and free food.
Yeah.
But yeah, so one of the last questions I've got for you, when I was having a nosy on your academic profile, I saw that you'd written a paper on, pardon me if I mispronounce this, Chthonic, an awesome kind of somewhat theatrical black metal band from
Yeah.
Taiwan. Um, so I saw these guys live at Download Festival in
Oh, super.
Donington in England, and they were fantastic. This was
Yeah.
before I knew what Taiwan was, but I do
Right,
remember
okay.
I didn't know that they were, related to China at all. I thought it was somewhere in Southeast Asia, stupidly. But I remember
Right.
they took a smartphone. Sorry, the guy the singer took out his iPhone, took a picture of the crowd, and said something like, "I'm sending this to our president. He's a bastard. Fuck him," or something. And I found that really funny. Um,
Yes.
uh, so, have you ever seen this band? Are you a Chinese slash Chinese language rock and metal aficionado? And what's the paper about, and how can one read it?
Okay. Well, yes, I'm a big metal fan.
Hell yes.
I've been a metal fan for years. Grew up listening to Slayer and Testament and Metallica and these types of bands, and then graduated into grunge and punk and so on and so forth. So, yeah, when I found out that, or we actually were living in Taiwan, we used to go to certain pubs and clubs and stuff like that. And every now and then you'd get this local band that all of a sudden they're playing metal, which kind of doesn't meet the expectation that you assume. I mean, internationally, you get canto pop and mando pop and
Yeah.
K-pop and J-pop and all of these other types of things. So it was actually really cool to see some of these. I've not seen Shanling is their Chinese name. I've not seen them live, unfortunately. Partly, well, I've never been around where I could see them live because I lived in Taiwan in the late '90s, before they kind of became a presence and so on.
Right.
So I've missed out. I've communicated with them. I've exchanged kind of emails and stuff when I was working on this particular paper.
Oh, awesome.
So it was great. They're really interesting. I mean, the lead singer is a member of the Legislative Yuan now in Taiwan. He ran for office and won on a ticket promoting Taiwanese independence, hence the "fuck our president" type of thing.
Right. He
Which
would have
is,
been the KMT in charge at that time, I think. Right.
yes, yeah, yeah. It would have been Ma Ying-jeou that he was referencing. He didn't run as a DPP candidate, so the Democratic Progressive Party, which is the
They're
current.
currently, yeah.
Yeah, that's where Tsai Ing-wen, she's a member of that party. He ran as an independent, but they're aligned on many things. But he's a very kind of ardent supporter of Taiwanese independence, and this actually has come out in some of their music. So one of their earlier albums, it's a narrative story of clashing spirits and ghosts between mainland China and Taiwan,
Oh dear.
which is actually really great because it's about these mainlanders who come over and then have these Taiwanese wives and get them pregnant, and then they run back to the mainland and so on and so forth, and leave them destitute with the child. And it's these battling spirits between the two kind of sides of the Taiwan Strait, and it's a great album. I can't remember the name of it now, but I've got their whole discography. If I had my computer able to access it, I would tell you the name specifically. But I mentioned it in the paper, actually, I believe. So I got interested in them through listening to Taiwanese underground music and
Mm.
metal music and so on. And they're black metal. They're actually melodic black metal. Metal.
Yeah, they're not for listeners who might be interested but might be put off by them being Scandinavian-ish.
Yeah.
Actually, though, that's not fair. If you think they're just growling and horror, it's really not. They're quite
No.
catchy, some of their songs.
They are, yeah. And then, well, they've done a lot to incorporate traditional instruments
Yes. Yeah.
into their music. So you get the erhu, and you get these other instruments that I guess originate on the mainland in China proper itself, and then kind of get variations and develop differently in Taiwan in terms of how they're used. Their face painting is I guess comes from two traditions. One, they were big Kiss fans. So face painting and Kiss and all of that type of stuff, right? I remember growing up and they all said that Kiss stood for Knights in Satan's Service. So there's an element there, I guess, of face painting. But it also draws upon Taiwanese puppet traditions where you have
Ah,
puppet theater, which is really elaborate. It's not shadow puppets; it's these really elaborate puppets that they use on stage for different shows, and they have these fantastic costumes and makeup and stuff on the puppets, and they fly across the stage and so on and so forth. So it draws on a Taiwanese tradition as well, which is really neat. So yeah, I guess I'm a metal aficionado in a sense. There's a lot of other good bands in
mm,
Taiwan. There's a great actual from China itself called PK14, which is
okay. Is
a
that
great band.
Peking or
Well, you can ask them, I guess, as to how
yeah.
they want to use it. They played a little bit at the Mao Live Bar in Beijing, if
Oh,
anybody's
I
been there.
yeah.
But their roots, I guess, they've actually their drummer is European, if I remember correctly. He's non-Chinese, anyways.
Okay.
But their main influence would probably be Fugazi, if
Huh.
people know who Fugazi are.
Chinese
Um,
Fugazi.
yeah, Chinese Fugazi. Yeah, so there's elements of that. So there's that kind of screeching lyrics and stuff. But they also touch on a lot of sensitive issues in terms of kind of history and politics and so on and so forth. So in a sense, like Shanling in Taiwan, and I think that's
Mm.
something that gets overlooked when people think of metal music. They just think it's shouting into a microphone and and a loud noise. It's not
Well,
really
those
music.
bits are good too, but
Those bits are great too. Yeah, I actually that's what I love. It's just, there's nothing better than putting on something like that. But yeah, so it's PK14 is a good band. There are other ones as well. So yeah, I mean, over my time living in Taiwan, living in China, I also got into Korean music as well,
mm.
underground music. They have trying to remember the name of it. It's Death Records or something like that. It's for metal bands and
Okay.
black metal and death metal bands in Korea. It's near. For those of you who are familiar with Seoul, it's in and around the Hongdae area. So
Oh yeah.
Hongik University area, the Hongdae area. There's some good shows and indie music and stuff. And I think my interest in it is I don't like pop music that's sung in English. And when I went to Asia first, I wasn't, not interested in pop music whatsoever. So it's about finding out about stuff, and it's a great way
Yeah.
to meet people. And then you kind of see like, wow, there's this whole other scene that's there. That's you can see resemblances to what I grew up with, living, listening to that type of music. So yeah, there's, I guess, it was great to kind of get into it and experience it. And Shanling is one of the best. I still hope to see them, although I think they're not touring so much anymore because Freddie Lim, the lead singer, is busy in office, so his time is occupied, I guess, to some extent.
Well, good for him.
How can one read the paper?
Yes.
The last bit, you need to get access to positions, East Asia Critique or Asia Critique as it's called now. That's the journal.
Uh-huh.
I can maybe share in some regards, but I'm bound by copyright myself, so I
Yeah.
have to be careful about how
Don't get
much
in
I do
trouble.
share it, type of thing. But it's interesting because in the paper itself, I don't only talk about Shanling. I talk about one of their albums specifically called Sadiq Bale, which was then, that story is about the Musha uprising, or in Chinese it's the Wushe Shijian, which happened in 1930 Taiwan, and it was this uprising against the Japanese colonial authorities by the Aboriginal people. It's a great story, actually. It's yeah, there's different elements to it, and it's been remembered differently. So Shanling does this concept album that retells the story. In the paper, I also compare a novel by Wu He, a contemporary Taiwanese novelist, who his novel is actually called The Remains of Life, that Michael Berry just translated, or finally finished the translation. I think it was about a year ago. And it's talking about the people who live after this uprising, and then up into the present day. And there's other things in contemporary Taiwan issues as well, because the historical event has been remembered and memorialized differently depending on who you ask. So for the Aborigines, it was a headhunting kind of expedition. It wasn't necessarily against the Japanese as such. It was just simply against an invading group of people.
It wasn't patriotism.
It wasn't necessarily patriotism in that kind of nation state type of idea.
Yeah.
The Chinese, it was an anti-colonial uprising, of course, and that's
under the red flag.
Yeah, that's in reference actually as a Han Chinese kind of outlook on it. So the KMT people who fled to Taiwan in 49, and then for the local Taiwanese, they saw it as also an anti-colonial movement. But for them, of course, it was an anti-colonial movement by actual Taiwanese. And for Taiwanese, they look at colonialism having ended in 1987 when martial law was ended by the KMT. So it's a very complicated type of story that's there. And that's what I examine in the paper. And then I think it was a year after the paper was published, there was a movie made as well called Warriors of the Rainbow. It's a great film, actually, by the way, by a Taiwanese director whose name escapes me at the moment. So I'm hoping to expand that paper as a chapter in my own book, and then kind of examine the novel, Shanling's album, and then the movie as well, as ways of looking at this story and looking at how it's remembered and so on and so forth.
Awesome. My time is kind of running out. So second...
Sorry, that was a kind of a long answer to that question. I'm a big metal fan, so I love talking about it.
Well, honestly, if you ever wanted to talk about it again, off air or on air, please do. There's more things I could say if I had the time, more humble brags about which bands I've seen. So yes, penultimate question. What are you reading right now? And are there any books, Chinese, Taiwanese, Korean, or completely otherwise, that you'd like to recommend to listeners of the show?
So actually right now I'm reading, I've got an English book that I've just finished, actually. I'm a big fan of Kim Stanley Robinson, who's a science fiction author, famous for his Mars trilogy that was written in the 80s. And I just finished reading, actually it's an older book by him, The Years of Rice and Salt. Is that the right title? The Years of Salt and Rice, one way or the other. But it's an alternate history novel. So it starts with instead of Europe only losing half of its population with the Black Death, it actually loses about 95% of its population. So the European continent itself becomes essentially uninhabited, and then that's a starting point for history. And then what would history have developed like if it weren't for if the Europe was not there, basically?
The Kazakhstani Empire, I would hope.
Well, actually, the European continent becomes Islamic, and
there you go.
It's interesting how that kind of spreads out. And China, of course, becomes much more of a player on the world stage. Then there's no kind of dark period for China in the sense of it being, a crumbling empire and taken advantage of by European colonial powers and so on and so forth. Interestingly, the few Europeans that are left are Scots.
Well,
I
we are
guess
quite
way
isolated.
up in the British Isles, the Scotland, some of the population is saved from the Black Death in
There's
this
a
novel.
Scottish comedian from Glasgow called Frankie Boyle, and he did a joke where when global warming comes, we'll be England will be under the waves, and we'll be laughing, sitting on the tops of our mountains, eating mangoes that we're growing.
Yeah, exactly. So, but that was a great novel, and I just finished that one, and I'm also reading a Taiwanese novel by Song Zilong, who is
Okay.
a very well-known author in Taiwan, not really necessarily well-known overseas, but in the mid 80s, in 1985, he published this novel called Fei Xu Taiwan, so Ruined Taiwan,
Ah.
and it's a nearer future story, at least when it was written in 85. And actually, most of the story takes place in 2010 and then 2015. It's only a few years ago. But it's the aftermath of nuclear fallout in Taiwan, where the nuclear power plants overloaded and then contaminated parts of the island. And there's, the politics involved in telling the story of this contamination, the death that's there,
Mhm.
media kind of reportage of it, and then people trying to discover the truth of the event and so on and so forth. And I mean, it was interesting reading this novel now because it was republished a couple of years ago in the aftermath of Fukushima, of course, in
Mhm.
Japan.
Yes.
And so it's interesting reading this. So it's an environmental novel in many ways that comments on Taiwan's rapid industrialization in the 1980s,
Mm.
pulled from this kind of future perspective from when it was written. But in a sense, it's a true story because many of these things have happened, and there's great worry, of course, with all the nuclear power plants in Taiwan that it's another Fukushima is just waiting to happen type of
Mm.
thing.
I
Um,
just finished my own dissertation on Chinese sci-fi, and
right?
time constraints, working a part-time job and doing this thing. I wanted to also the constraint of word count was probably the main thing. I wanted
Yeah.
to look into and research Taiwanese sci-fi because I could see there were some great novels, but
Yes.
I sealed it off so that I would be able to complete the dissertation properly. But
Yeah, for
it seems
sure.
like a rich seam.
Yeah, no, very much so. And then Ruin Taiwan's a great. It's a great read. I'm just about finished that one as well now. I always usually have about one or two or three books on the go at the same time. So it's a
Yeah.
really great novel that would be hopefully translated one day. We'll see. And then I just finished reading another one called Ground Zero, another Taiwanese novel that is about a similar story written by Jiang, and it was written only a couple of years ago. It's actually written after Fukushima, and that one also deals with this idea of natural calamity and disaster. So it's that was a good read as well. Very interesting kind of take. But if
Mm.
you are looking for Taiwanese science fiction, you should start with Jiang, who wrote in the 1980s mostly. He's got this Cities trilogy, which is fantastic.
Okay.
He's actually a physicist in the United States, teaches at university. So it's one of those novels that it's a combination of kind of hard science, but at the same time also martial arts. So
Oh, there you go.
it's really good. It's a really great trilogy. There is a translation of it as well, Zhang Xiguo, the Cities trilogy. If you Google it, you'd be able to find it's a good translation as well. But yeah, he's kind of one of the main father figures of Taiwanese science fiction, I guess. Sort of like Liu Cixin in mainland China would be.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for that recommendation. Here's your final question.
Okay.
Is there any of your own work or online platforms that you'd like to plug for listeners to check out?
Um, I don't have any actual work online in terms of my own writing or translations and stuff.
Mhm.
I don't really have a big online presence, to be honest. I've
Good
got
for you.
my LinkedIn account, and that's kind of it
It's great
for
news
the
for your
most part.
sanity.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I certainly use online resources, but I try to minimize my digital footprint as much as I can, I think.
I'm just doing it so that something's left behind after I die, basically.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's good enough a reason, I think.
Yeah, so I suppose we could recommend Decoded, you and Olivia's translation from My Jia. That could be one for interested parties
I
to check out. And of course, Empires
definitely
of Dust.
Decoded and certainly the second one, In the Dark. I think both of those are great novels, and of course, Empires of Dust. Please
Oh,
have a look at it. And hopefully, we've got a couple of new books coming out as well before long. So
oh,
yeah,
exciting.
keep this.
Watch
Yeah,
this
I
space.
guess keep watching the space. Yeah, for sure.
All right. Big thank you for Christopher for coming on the show. That was a really great interview. I really enjoyed that. Our next guest in the next episode, episode 15, will also be very awesome. It is a big name, let's say. I won't spoil just who it is just yet. You can get an advance preview? That's the wrong word. You can find out in advance who that will be if you follow us on Instagram, TrChFic, or if you follow my Twitter, Angus Likes Words. I'll be doing a wee announcement of the guest ahead of time for that episode. Don't forget, you can support the show on Patreon and also buy me a coffee. And do tell your friends about the show, do tell your dog, do tell your village chief, tell your factory boss, and tell your mistress if you have one, if you're anything like Guo Cunqian, which I really hope you're not. So, all that said, enjoy yourself until the time of the next episode, and 再见。
下个古城。